Funding for Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff is provided by the Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation. America's war on terrorism and the conflict in Iraq underscore many of the issues involved in the decades-long Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Which Middle Eastern nations are supporting the violence, and why? Is this a clash of civilizations or a desperate effort by a handful of despotic regimes to stay in power? And how do prospects for peace in Gaza and the West Bank rest on a positive outcome in Baghdad? For part 2 of our discussion of Middle East politics, Policy Watch is joined again by Martin Indyk, two-time U.S. Ambassador to Israel, former Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Policy, and now Director of the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. Now, from the University of Maryland, the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Martin Indyk, welcome to the University of Maryland and Policy Watch. You talked about Iraq. Has our, at least preliminary victory in Iraq made things easier for peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis?
It created a moment. The president was absolutely right. Before the war, he said, if we remove Saddam Hussein, it will create a moment of opportunity for Israeli-Palestinian peace.
And you think that moment has passed?
That moment has definitely passed. But it was there. No question it was there. Why? Because removing Saddam Hussein and doing it so quickly and effectively had an impact on all the other vectors affecting the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. The balance of power between Israel and the Arab states shifted dramatically in Israel's favor because the Iraqi army had evaporated. There is no longer any Eastern Front coalition, Arab coalition, that can threaten Israel. The balance of power on the other side had shifted in favor of the moderates. Iran, Syria were both on the defensive. The United States had become their neighbor with a huge army, and a very effective army too. And they were now keeping their heads down. They were telling Hezbollah and Hamas, you better cool it. And they were cooling it. Hamas sued for a ceasefire. Hezbollah kept quiet in Lebanon. So there was a moment in which it would be possible for the moderates, like Abu Mazen, to stand up and say, violence and terrorism doesn't work. Let's negotiate. And that was a moment in which we had to act. The president started in the right vein with that Aqaba summit. But we simply didn't take advantage of the opportunity. And then, of course, there's that symbiotic relationship in which actions in Iraq help the Israeli-Palestinian process. The reverse is true too. We stumble in Iraq, we get into trouble there, it looks like we're ineffective, we're bogged down in a quagmire. Then the rogues start to notice. And then they see, well, maybe we don't have to be so concerned. Maybe the Americans are drawing short of breath. One Syrian commentator said, the Americans have 1 foot planted in Iraq with flames under it, and 1 foot planted in Palestine with flames under it, and all we have to do is waft the smoke between America's legs, and they'll withdraw. So this sense that, they're no longer on the defensive has affected the calculations of Hezbollah and Hamas, certainly Hamas. Ceasefire broke down as a result of Hamas terrorist attacks. And you see the way in which trouble in Iraq leads to trouble on the Palestinian front. And now, the president has declared basically that his whole effort on the Palestinian track has stalled. He's blamed Arafat and he's walking away from it. So, we're bogged down in Iraq and we're nowhere on the Palestinian front.
You mentioned the other countries and their aid to Hamas. Can Hamas and the other groups, the extreme groups, maintain the current level of activity without outside support? There isn't enough indigenous financing, is there, for their efforts?
Hamas definitely has indigenous support, and we shouldn't underestimate that. Its popularity is greater today than it was before the Intifada broke out. It has about 30% support. Before the Intifada, it was about 13, 15%. It's just about doubled its popularity. But you're absolutely right that the external support is critical. It gives it the oxygen. What is that? That's funding in particular. And the money comes, as in the past, come from America, comes from Saudi Arabia in particular, a large amount from Saudi Arabia, and increasingly from Iran. And during the Intifada, the Iranians were the most aggressive outside force in terms of pumping in money and arms smuggling through Hezbollah in Lebanon. And this they didn't do just for Hamas, they also did it increasingly now for the Tanzim, the Fatah, the nationalist forces, who are also involved in violence and terror. They're getting money from the Iranians as well.
Is there so little the United States can do to cut off that flow?
We are doing a lot to cut it off, and progress has been made, including with the Saudis. The Saudis have just stopped, the government stopped collection of money in mosques. That will make a difference. But the foundations that give money to what are ostensibly charitable causes, Hamas comes fundraising for their schools and education, and the money goes to help the terrorists. So cutting that off is a full-time task in terms of getting the Saudis to take a whole series of actions. They've started. They should get credit for starting. But we should be very clear they've got to do more than that. Stopping the Iranians is a much harder task.
Let's talk for a few minutes about the broader Middle East. You've called some of the states there frozen states, and I must say in my only visit to the Middle East, I was struck by the fact that when I was in Israel, I was in the 20th century, this was 1995, and I felt as if I was at least 100 years behind when I was in Jordan. It seems like an entirely different culture, an entirely different economic situation, and it seems as if they're the only well, except for Africa, they're the only major geographic area of the world that's not come into the 21st century. Am I exaggerating that? And what hope is there?
Yes, you're exaggerating.
Okay.
You should go to Jordan now, and you'll see that it is a very different story under King Abdullah, young king, who gets it, who was one of the first, I think it was the first country in the Arab world to become WTO compliant with the World Trade Organization's requirements, deregulation, so on. Has now managed to negotiate a free trade agreement with the United States, the first in the Arab world, is determined to go ahead with economic reforms and political reforms. And the country is moving. It's had a growth rate of 6% a year over the last few years. Israel, for instance, its growth rate is negative over the last couple of years. So Jordan is changing quite dramatically. There are other parts of the Arab world that are getting plugged in to the 21st century, to the global revolution. Tunisia and in the Maghreb, Morocco as well, in the Gulf, Qatar, United Arab Emirates. These are countries that are certainly doing what they need to do to catch up.
And do they leverage the Egypts and the Syrias?
No, not yet. The point about all these countries that I've just listed is that they're small countries. They're on the periphery. Well, Jordan is the exception there, it's in the center, but they're on the periphery. There are 4 big Arab countries that dominate the Arab world: Egypt, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Syria. And they're the ones that have frozen regimes, that are unwilling and unable, it seems, to undertake the kinds of political and economic reforms that would free up their people, open up some political space, get the private sector working in a way that would enable them to meet the needs of their people. But they're stuck. Now, the regime in Iraq is gone. If we succeed, and it will take time, but if we succeed in establishing a stable, pluralistic government there that is representative of all the different communities in Iraq, with the oil flowing out and the foreign investment coming in. The Iraqis just yesterday announced a whole series of new economic regulations to attract foreign investors. You get the change in that, in the Iraqi regime, together with the changes that are taking place on the periphery, it can infect, if you like, the other regimes, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. But it's gonna take success in Iraq. It's the same as the connection with the peace process. If we succeed in Iraq, it will have a ripple effect on political and economic change in the rest of the region. And if we fail there, it will solidify the large countries, the regimes there, in their beliefs that this is a mistake to even dare to start to open up their systems, for the fear that it will destabilize them.
So I won't ask you whether you agreed with the administration when it started on the Iraqi operation.
You can ask.
All right. Did you agree?
Yes, absolutely. The Clinton administration, when I happened to be Assistant Secretary of State in 1998, declared as its objective regime change in Iraq. This was not a Bush administration idea. We did it because we knew how evil the Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein was, and we felt that containment was failing, that we would not be able to stop him from acquiring weapons of mass destruction. He had his programs in place, he had his people in place, and the inspectors were unable to find anything, as they're unable to find anything now. So there was a feeling that we were going to have to do something about this. But it wasn't an imminent threat. It didn't require immediate act of war. The president could have taken his time. It was a right objective, wrongly implemented. He could have taken his time to plan for the post-war reconstruction. He could have taken his time to build the coalition, a real coalition. He could have taken his time to get the Security Council resolution, and they could have gotten it. They just were so determined to do this on their own, taking advantage of the willingness of the American people to support this kind of action, which they weren't when we declared the objective back in 1998. There's no way the American people would have supported sending 150,000 troops into Iraq at that point. We had that opportunity, but unfortunately, he went about it with a kind of hubris that led him to ignore all of the kinds of things that needed to be put in place before taking on such a mammoth task.
You've talked a great deal about Rabin, and the Israeli people now are led by another old war horse, Ariel Sharon. What can you tell us?
Friend of Yitzhak Rabin's, by the way, because they were generals together. Ariel Sharon is an interesting character. He's, in my opinion, he's three Sharons competing for the mind of the Prime Minister. The first is the general, who's quite familiar to us. He's the man who sent the Israeli army into Lebanon, besieged Arafat in Beirut, and kicked him out. And Sharon the general would do exactly the same thing with Arafat if the circumstances arise and make it possible. And he's moving towards that now. He's the man who believes in force. More importantly, Sharon the general is the one who believes in the high ground, in a classic sense of a tank commander. And that's why he put his settlements, the settlements he built, on the high ground in the West Bank. And that's why he, unlike the four previous prime ministers, Rabin, Peres, Netanyahu, and subsequently Barak, all of them were prepared to withdraw fully from the Golan Heights. Sharon is not interested in that. He's not interested in negotiations with the Syrians, because from his point of view, the Golan is the high ground, and he wants that terrain to protect Israel. That's Sharon the general. Sharon, the politician, is the master of the game. There is no Israeli politician like him. He manages to move left and to move right with such alacrity, somewhat like an Egyptian belly dancer, in order to maintain a broad-based coalition. And he's succeeded very well in these circumstances in building that broad-based coalition and maintaining it. Better than any previous prime minister, including Rabin, by the way. And then there's Sharon, the would-be statesman. He's the man who talks about painful concessions, who in Aqaba stood up and said, it is in Israel's interests that there be a Palestinian state. This is a revolutionary thing for a right-wing leader to say in Israel. And he's the one who has volunteered that in certain circumstances he would evacuate settlements, who's prepared to sign up to the roadmap, to freeze the settlements, to agree to a Palestinian state with provisional borders, and to provide it with contiguity, a term that he himself introduced in his Aqaba speech, which means that there would have to be settlements evacuated in order to provide for that territorial contiguity. Sharon, the would-be statesman, believes it is a strategic imperative for Israel not to allow any daylight to show between the United States and Israel. And therefore he will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid any kind of tension with President Bush. And I've seen it myself when I worked with him for President Bush, that when he felt that the president was serious, he would not cross him. He would do his bidding. And in a way that previous prime ministers had not done, he would agree to things without negotiating, without arguing. That really constantly surprised me. Now, what does that mean? Is that if you've got these three personalities fighting for the mind of the prime minister, whichever is dominant at any particular moment depends on the circumstances. If there's terrorism, Sharon the general will be dominant. If Labour's leaving the government or so on, Sharon the politician will be dominant. If the President of the United States is insisting on something, then Sharon the would-be statesman will respond to him. And that's where, unfortunately, the Bush administration has not understood the way in which the President can work with the Prime Minister to develop an agreed approach that could be sold to the Palestinians, that would provide a political basis for a solution. It's our lack of engagement, except for that one short moment after the Iraq War, that has led Sharon the statesman, the would-be statesman, essentially to be dormant. And that's unfortunate. Because Sharon the politician, if Sharon the statesman emerges dominant, Sharon the politician could actually deliver the goods in a way that no previous prime minister, or I expect prime ministers in the future, would be able to do. He can evacuate settlements. He's the only one who did evacuate settlements back as part of the Israel-Egypt peace treaty. He can freeze settlements. Nobody could touch him on that. Barak, Rabin, Peres, they wouldn't stop the settlement movement, and they certainly wouldn't evacuate settlements. They didn't have, as left-wing prime ministers, they didn't have the political strength to do it. But Sharon could do it if the statesman became dominant. And for the statesman to become dominant, the President of the United States has to sit down with him and get him to move.
Where does the President get him to move? You've proposed, I think, a trusteeship for the Palestinian areas. Is that what you think the President should push towards?
Well, there's, in a sense, two separate questions. The trusteeship relates to the problem on the Palestinians, so I'll come back to that for a moment. Working with Sharon, given what I've said about him, let's remember, he was the first Israeli politician to propose a Palestinian state. He now has his cabinet on record by accepting the roadmap, accepting a Palestinian state. A state with provisional borders is something that could be agreed on between Bush and Sharon, in which the Palestinian territory in the West Bank would be expanded to, say, 55, 60%, with provisional borders. Within those borders, settlements would be evacuated, so they would have contiguity. And that would be the start of the process. The negotiations would continue over what the final borders would be. But that interim step would give the Palestinians something very worthwhile, statehood and evacuation of some settlements, and a freeze on the rest, by the way, and give a time of testing for Israel to see whether, with a state in those circumstances, the Palestinians would generate a responsible approach in terms of dealing with the terrorist infrastructure that would make it possible for Israel to move on and agree to the expansion to the final borders of the Palestinian state. That's something that Sharon would go along with if Bush were to sit down and work it out with him. Now, so as far as the trusteeship is
hold
concerned,
up. So Israel cedes 60% of the territory.
now, Israel has already ceded 42%.
But now
Now
it
it would
says
expand that
to
to
60. It says, we want to see, if not an end to terrorism, a sharp reduction. Terrorism does not end. It does not even go down. Does Israel then have to go back in?
That's
in
in essence, yes, that if it breaks down, Israel always has the option of going back in again. But it's not a good option for Israel. And that's why, as I say, that they will be prepared, I believe, to try this. Now, the point about the trusteeship comes in here, because the problem with the roadmap and the problem with any future deal is that you do not have on the Palestinian side a capable and responsible leadership. So you've got, as I say, a roadmap, you've got the potential for Sharon signing up to a meaningful second phase of the roadmap, Palestinian state with provisional borders, but you don't have a responsible Palestinian partner. That's especially the case now with Arafat back in control, who by definition, because of everything that he's done, is irresponsible. So the idea of the trusteeship is that the international community blesses a US-led operation to short-circuit this process. The state with provisional borders is essentially established as a trusteeship under a US-led arrangement in which the Israeli army would withdraw from, let's say, the 60%. And the trustees would oversee the growing of a responsible, representative, accountable Palestinian leadership. Grow the democratic institutions the president is committed to. Grow the transparent economic institutions, the independent judiciary. Restructure the security services. And in the meantime, bolster them with special forces, not peacekeeping forces, but special forces, led by the United States, but you wouldn't have a lot of Americans involved. Canadians, Australians, British, who would come in and support the operations of the Palestinian security services in acting against the terrorists, in support of this Palestinian state that would be given birth before their eyes. So the Palestinians would have something to gain from stopping the terrorism in those circumstances. The trusteeship would be dissolved once the Palestinians had developed this responsible leadership. It was a way of short-circuiting the process and providing an answer to the fundamental flaw that makes it impossible now to make progress, because you don't have that partner on the Palestinian side that you can deal with.
But that would require some Palestinian body of some sort to say, yes, we agree to a trusteeship. You're not talking about another invasion.
It depends on the circumstances. Yeah, you're right. There's not going to be an invasion either against the Israeli army or against the will of the Palestinians. There are many Palestinians, including, I might say, Abu Mazen himself, who want the trusteeship, who understand that in the present circumstances they can't achieve what needs to be done in terms of creating this responsible leadership, because Arafat and his cronies are in the way. So how do you do that? How do you take authority away from them? Well, through a Security Council resolution that would do this, or in circumstances in which the whole situation explodes. It's not difficult to imagine that after another series of terrorist attacks, which Hamas and Islamic Jihad are planning at the moment, that Israel would do two things. Evict Yasser Arafat, as they've decided to do in principle, and move the Israeli army into Gaza to take care of the terrorist infrastructure there. When that happens, should it happen, God forbid that we should have such circumstances, but should it happen, the Palestinian Authority will collapse once Arafat is thrown out. And there will be large loss of life. First of all, unfortunately, Israeli loss of life, and then Palestinian loss of life. And the circumstances could then be created in which the international community will cry out for intervention. And Arafat will be gone, so the situation on the Palestinian side will then be ripe for that kind of trusteeship. However, we have to be realistic here. If the trusteeship we've established in Iraq was functioning effectively now, this argument would have much greater sway in the United States than the idea that we've got a failing trusteeship on the Iraqi side, we're going to go and do it on the Palestinian side too.
And let's not forget Afghanistan.
And Afghanistan as well. So at this particular moment, it doesn't have a lot of currency here. Interestingly, you had Senator Lugar and Senator Warner both talking about the idea of putting troops in there to help the Palestinian security services deal with the terrorists. So there's some interest in it, but in these current circumstances, I don't think it's realistic.
Martin Indyk, thank you very much on behalf of the University of Maryland and Policy Watch.
Funding for Policy Watch with Doug Bejeroff is provided by the Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation.
We are PBS.